Thank you, Desian. Thank you to his colleagues too for inviting me today and yesterday. I'd like to pick up some of the themes we've heard already. You'll hear about from me of trying to improve bee numbers, populations. You'll hear about from me on how we can quantify the impact of declines of bee populations, and you'll also hear how we can analyse the pollens that bees may be carrying in the type of detective work. So I'll explain all those things as they come along. You don't need me to tell you again, but of all the many things causing trouble to bees, these are three of the ones we've heard. I think this year listed 10, didn't he? But I think that these are thought to be three of the big ones. Pesticides, I won't name which ones, but there are some are rather dangerous. Habitat loss, and of course varroa mite. And if you look on this little picture here, there is a varroa mite on that bee just there. I'm working in New Zealand, by the way, so anything that you think could have invaded New Zealand has invaded New Zealand, including me. So it's hard work. It's where I live, 0.5% of the biodiversity, plant biodiversity, on the land is endemic. 0.5% of the plants in lowland New Zealand are endemic, so 99.5% are introduced. That's the environment we work in. And the honeybees included in that. We have 4 species of bumblebee too, which we may talk about later. In fact, we will talk about later. So these are the things I wanted to ask about and invite you to consider, and I'll try to answer them at least partly. Can we improve, or can we make more refugia for bees? We're working on bumblebees in this. Can we make more nests for them, given that modern agriculture is in a terrible state in many cases, with hardly any diversity left? Bumblebees, for example, like to nest in old mouse nests in New Zealand, but in most agriculture there aren't any mouse nests, so we give them help. When we have these famous agri-environment schemes that are all over Europe, and the European Union pays good money, do they work? And David Klein showed years ago that sometimes we think they're working, but they're not really very good. That's the second question. And thirdly, if we want to know which flowers the bees have fed on, and we're not there to watch them, can we quantify that to some extent by analysing the pollens that they carry back to the nest? We tried some DNA and other techniques for the last example. So if we just go to the beginning again, then let's look at the role of refuges, and can they actually make a difference, or is it just a game for school kids? So these schemes are fine, maybe, they look pretty, you know very well. But are those species of flowers the right ones? Are they in the right proportion? Are they the right mixture? Are the right time of year? And do they work? And we heard about David Klein before. I mean, he's shown once or twice that some of these are not very good and even unanalysable. The question has not been asked correctly. So can we do that better? The sort of mantra that we recite, the bees and actual natural enemies of pests as well need, they usually are considered by us anyway to need these 4 things. And if we can go to what was or is a monoculture, a crop like we saw in some of the photographs already, 1 crop to the horizon, heavy herbicide use, no refuges, no nothing, you can bet your life the bees have lost somewhere to shelter when the rain is coming down, somewhere to make the nest, which of course is shelter. They need access to nectar, of course, they need access to pollen, of course, and they need access to alternative flowers, which is the basis of the agri-environment schemes, as we discussed before. If we just play around with these numbers, you get SNAP, and if I'm talking to farmers or students and I mention SNAP, like this, they always answer that exam question. Always answer that exam question, because we all like acronyms, don't we? If it's a ladybird or a parasitic wasp, that's what they want. If it's a bee, that's what they want. And modern farming just knocks these things down, as you know very well. So, we know about Klein, I mentioned him just now, and Dr. Garrett just mentioned him. Some of these schemes cost a lot of money, but they don't work very well. So what can we do about that? Let's look at the S of SNAP, which is shelter. This isn't pretty flowers in this case, this is nests for, in this case, bumblebees. So we've put out some of these nests. Actually we call them bumblebee motels because there's 4 units in one long box. And we ask the question whether we can get bumblebees to use these nest boxes in an otherwise austere environment. Can we encourage bees to nest on the farmland? So the really simple things are made out of wood. This is about 1 metre, or you can see it's 1.1 metres long. We have a false floor, and we have some roofing insulation material inside. So there's one in position by a fence. you'll learn in a minute that is a ridiculous place to put a bumblebee box, because there's no shelter, and the bees will cook in the sunshine. So that's a nice photo, but the wrong place. And here are some workers just beginning to make nests in the insulation layer we put inside that box. So do they make a difference, therefore, to bee numbers on farmland? And I'll play you a bit of music now, just to liven up the atmosphere, but I won't sing, because all I can sing is Bob Dylan, and you wouldn't want to hear that, okay? So I'll play you some music. And this just gives you an example of what a successful bumblebee motel can be. If I can get the cursor to work, we'll all be happy. Can you do it, Disio? Can I get the right, there we are, right. It's just a delay of 3 or 4 seconds, but you'll see the idea. And here comes some nice music, but not me singing. So there's the box. 2 of the 4 units have colonies in. This is the colony. You can even see the photographer, the man making the film, see the reflection of his camera in the honeypot here, because he's looking down into the honeypot. And there's a cameraman taking there he is, look, don't know what his name was, but there he is, filming that. So when it works, it's beautiful, you know. And for most bumblebee species, you would expect 500 workers in that box. So is it useful? Is it worth making the effort? It only cost a few dollars each. So we did this years ago, actually, and it's still quite a useful paper. We tracked the occupancy of these boxes for 4 years. And in the first year, it's really disappointing, all that work. We put out 80 motels, and a trivial percentage were occupied. But we kept the work going for a while, and in the end, we got about 8 or 9% occupancy. There were 80 boxes out there, so call that, I don't know, 14 boxes, 15 boxes, each with 500. So we were adding 500 bees times 15 to that farm, which is a hell of a lot. You know, 6,000 or 7,000 bumblebee workers added to one field. So multiply the 500 workers per box by the number of boxes occupied, and it's quite a useful contribution of bumblebees to that field. Whether it improves pollination is another matter, and we need to investigate that in a second. More recently, we did this in a giant grass you may have heard of called Miscanthus, which is a sterile hybrid grass, originally from China, and it produces up to 40 tons of cellulose per hectare per year. And it's great potential for biofuel, for liquid biofuel. But we've now identified, and there's the paper down here if you can read it, we've identified 16 ecosystem services derived from this giant sterile grass. It's unbelievable. It doesn't have any pollen. It has pollen, but it has no nectar. It's dry and dusty and looks as if it's sterile in many more ways than one. But we are producing 16 different ecosystem services from that, and that relates to this discussion we had about ecosystem services and economics earlier. In terms of our discussion, we are getting quite nice occupancy of these boxes in the shelter of this grass. But when we went to the field edge, it was a dairy farm where the shelter was very poor, you can't really see the red line because there was 0 occupancy. So these boxes are fine, but don't stick them out in the sunshine in a rubbish field around the margin because it's much too hot and the rain gets in and you get no bees. So the message is put them in the right place and we can get a useful contribution to bumblebee numbers and therefore we hope pollination in agriculture. New Zealand has 4 bumblebee species, by the way, all introduced, of course. Terrestris, Hortorum, Ruderatus and Subterraneous, if you know those species. Okay, so nest boxes do help. That shelter from snap does help. But what about the reason we're doing all this? We believe, don't we, and you've heard already, that the bee populations are declining. So we did an experiment. This is on an Asian brassica like bok choy or pak choy. And we just did experiments where we did partial exclusion of the bees. Now, it takes a little bit of thinking about this graph, so let's take it slowly. That's when we took, this is percentage unfertilized pods. We heard about lack of fertilization from Dr. Garrett earlier. So, if we do full pollination rates, no exclusion, no barriers, we have obviously a low proportion of unfertilized pods. But it's rather interesting then, this is the open field, with abundant bees, we might imagine. But look at this. It's still about 25 or 30% that don't get pollinated. So even in the so-called normal field, we have 30% of pods which are unfertilized, suggesting there weren't enough bees there in the first place. We then start cutting down the number of bees using those cages, 25% reduction, 50% reduction, and 75% reduction. And you can see a clear trend that as we reduce the number of bees available to the flowers, we get a much higher production of unfertilized pods, meaning that isn't yield, that's the opposite of yield, it's unfertilized pods. So these bumblebee boxes work fine, they get increasing numbers through time. Don't put them in the sunshine, otherwise you're wasting your time. And even with normal populations of bees, bumblebees and honeys, it still isn't a very good agro-ecosystem, as 30% don't even produce any seeds. So there's an important message there. So we played around with these cages and did some simple economics, much less simple than we've heard today. And if we look at kiwi fruit, which is the top export horticultural product in New Zealand, just a 25% reduction, so this end, that equivalent of that, and kiwi fruit, well, for New Zealand, that's quite a lot of money. 127 million per year. All the New Zealand crops that depend on pollinators, getting on for $1 billion New Zealand for a year. So it's not trivial, is it? So the final question then, first one was, can we help by providing nests? Yes, we can. Secondly, can we quantify what is bad about the agricultural system? The answer is we can. 30% of our plants are still not producing enough seed. Third question was, what about these agri-environment schemes that Klein talked about? There's Phacelia, if you may know that plant, it comes from North America. That's very frequently used in agri-environment schemes, on its own or mixed. And there it is here for an experiment we did. We wanted to try to see if, because it's pretty and cheap and everybody uses it, is it the right one? Does it do what we expect? What do we expect? We expect the bees to take pollen and nectar and become better pollinators. So here again we have these different species of flowers. There isn't Phacelia there, but there could be. If Phacelia was added, would it make a big difference? Is it providing something that these don't provide? Because many people think Phacelia is wonderful, and it does make good honey, and beekeepers often use it, but is it a good choice? So we spent ages standing by this Phacelia flower, like ning-nongs, to use an English word, looking at every bee that arrived, and we counted 23,472 bees. We went mad by the end of the day. But the most amazing thing is, only one took pollen. So if we think that Phacelia is a wonderful plant and it helps provide pollen and nectar, in those circumstances they didn't even look at the pollen, which means they're not getting protein for the larvae in their nest, are they? So pretty, abundant, cheap, everybody uses it, the European Union pays for it, but it isn't very good. So it just reinforces the idea that just because it's cheap and pretty may not be the best flower to use, and that's more or less what David Klein was implying, among other things, in his paper. Okay? Then we said, right, let's go to the bee and let the bee tell us not what it's thinking about taking, but what it has taken. And we started doing some DNA work, just looking at the possibility of identifying pollens using DNA. We can do that, actually. We also started doing some other fancy stuff, where we did electronic colour masking to try to tell us how many different pollens there were in this mixture from a bee pellet. Okay? So DNA can tell us what it's carrying, if we're lucky, and we can then count the different types based on this colour masking. And it can get quite sophisticated, and I'm very impressed by the people who did that. And this man, McNeil, plotted saturation against hue, and we got really clear separation of three types of pollen. These clustered here, and this one as an isolated one. I think that's rather clever, actually. Just by using light and measuring light in a different way, we can say how many types of pollen did that bee use. What types of pollen, what were their names, we can use DNA and other techniques. So to summarise then, do refuges make any difference? They certainly do for bumblebees. We can have 15,000 worker bees in one field compared with 0 before. They're really good. But where do we put them? not in an exposed area, otherwise you'll get 0 bees. It's obvious really, isn't it? These agri-environment schemes, yes, they do work, but sometimes people use the wrong plant in the wrong place and they think it's a wonder plant. And if it's pollen and nectar you want the bee to take, they don't touch the pollen. And finally, can we find out what pollens they're using? Yes, we can, by playing around with the light regime and by using DNA techniques. So can we enhance bees? Yes, we can. Can we find out what they're taking? Yes, we can. And can we quantify what's a good flower and a bad flower? And those 3 bullet points summarise that the answer is, as Hillary Clinton says, yes, we can. Okay? So that's the end of that. Thanks very much.